In the summer of 1918, American soldiers crouching in the mud of the Western Front learned to watch a simple wooden box. When the soft, gray creatures inside it suddenly compressed their bodies and sealed their skin shut, the soldiers knew they had only seconds to reach for their masks. They were not looking at a mechanical gauge or a sophisticated chemical sensor. They were staring at ordinary garden slugs. We usually think of military survival in terms of steel, discipline, and technology. The idea that a modern army would entrust the lives of thousands of men to a creature most people step on seems absurd. But the United States military had not resorted to slugs out of desperation. They had deployed them because these slow, unassuming animals possessed a biological superpower that no machine on Earth could replicate. If you had been standing in those trenches, your own senses would have betrayed you. By the time human biology registers the faint, sweet smell of mustard gas, the chemical has already begun to burn the lungs and blister the eyes. Your body simply is not built to detect the threat in time. You would need something that experienced the world entirely differently than you do. A nervous system tuned to a frequency you cannot even perceive. How a pest from an American garden ended up on the deadliest battlefields in human history is one of the strangest scientific accidents of the 20th century. And the reason they work so perfectly reveals something deeply unsettling about how fragile our own biology truly is. To understand why the slug was so crucial, you have to look at the terrifying reality of chemical warfare in the First World War. When mustard gas was introduced, it changed the fundamental psychology of combat. Unlike artillery shells or machine gun fire, gas did not announce itself with a deafening roar. It was silent, heavy, and invisible, creeping into the lowest parts of the trench where exhausted men were trying to sleep. The early gas masks were incredibly primitive, claustrophobic canvas hoods and rubber respirators that made it almost impossible to fight, communicate, or even breathe properly. Soldiers hated wearing them, and commanders knew that if an entire unit put on their mask every time a rumor of gas spread, the line would be paralyzed. The military desperately needed an early warning system. They tried using the standard solution for miners, canaries, and mice. But war zones are chaotic, loud, and filled with smoke, and birds would often panic or die from the general stress of the environment, causing false alarms. Even worse, when a canary actually did inhale mustard gas, its delicate respiratory system was destroyed. The bird died, meaning the Army needed a constant, impossible supply of fresh animals just to keep the warning system running. The military needed a creature that was hypersensitive to chemicals, entirely immune to the psychological terror of artillery fire, and capable of surviving the very poison it was detecting. They were asking for a biological impossibility. The answer did not come from a military laboratory, but from a quiet basement thousands of miles away from the front lines. Dr. Paul Bartsch was a malacologist, a scientist who studies mollusks, working at the National Museum of the Smithsonian Institution. For years, he had been observing the great gray slug, known scientifically as Limax maximus, in the damp furnace room of his own home. One evening, Bartsch noticed something strange. Whenever the furnace leaked a tiny, almost imperceptible amount of fumes, the slugs reacted violently. They did not flee because they could not move fast enough. Instead, they exhibited a highly specific, defensive physical response long before Bartsch himself could smell any smoke at all. Curious, Bartsch began to test their limits. He discovered that the slugs were acting as living, high-precision chemical sensors. A slug is essentially a creature turned inside out. Its body is covered in a sensitive mucous membrane, and it breathes through a visible pore on the side of its head called a pneumostome. Because they absorb so much of their environment directly through their skin, their nervous systems are tuned to detect microscopic changes in the air. When exposed to an irritant, the immediate reflex of the slug is to compress its entire body into a tight, hardened mound and snap its breathing pore tightly shut, sealing its internal organs away from the toxic air. When the military learned of the research from Bartsch, they ran their own tests and were stunned by the math. A human being can detect mustard gas at a concentration of about 1 part in 100,000. The great gray slug could detect it at 1 part in 10 to 12 million. The slugs were registering the presence of the deadly chemical when it was diluted to a fraction of a percent of what it took to trigger a human nose. It was the exact early warning system the Army had been searching for. By June of 1918, the United States military began quietly shipping thousands of slugs across the Atlantic Ocean, deploying them directly into the nightmare of the European trenches. The soldiers were ordered to keep the slugs in small boxes and watch them closely. The rules of engagement were simple. The moment the slugs compressed their bodies and closed their breathing pores, every man was to put on his gas mask immediately. But what made the slugs truly miraculous was not just their sensitivity, it was their resilience. A soldier exposed to mustard gas would suffer agonizing burns and respiratory failure. A canary would simply die. But the defense mechanism of the slug was perfect. By closing its breathing pore and shrinking its body, it completely protected its vital tissues. Once the gas dissipated and the trench was clear of the chemical, the slug would simply relax its muscles, open its pore, and go back to moving around the box completely unharmed. The same individual slug could detect a gas attack, save the lives of an entire platoon, survive the exposure, and be ready to detect the next attack a few hours later. They were infinitely reusable, entirely unfazed by the concussive blasts of artillery shells, and required almost zero maintenance. In the middle of the most heavily industrialized, mechanized conflict in human history, the most reliable piece of survival equipment was a garden pest. The presence of the slugs fundamentally altered the daily routine of the trenches. The psychological toll of chemical warfare came from the constant, invisible threat, the fear that every breath might be your last. But the slugs made the invisible visible. They gave the soldiers a physical gauge they could trust. Accounts from the period suggest that men who were exhausted and terrified found a strange comfort in watching the slow, deliberate movements of the animals in their boxes. As long as the slug was stretched out and breathing, the air was safe. The calm of the creature became the calm of the soldiers. This strange partnership forces us to reconsider how we define biological superiority. We tend to view evolution as a hierarchy with human intelligence and human senses sitting at the absolute top. We build massive technological infrastructures to extend our vision and our hearing, assuming that we are the ultimate arbiters of what is real in our environment. But the trenches of the First World War proved that our biology is dangerously blind to entire layers of reality. The slug did not need to understand geopolitics or the chemistry of mustard gas. Its ancient, primitive nervous system was simply better adapted to reading the true nature of the air than the brains of the men who fought the war. The great gray slug was not a weapon, and it was not a soldier. It was an interpreter. It stood in the space between human vulnerability and human destruction, translating a chemical threat into a physical motion that a terrified teenager in a muddy ditch could understand. In an environment where human technology had engineered new, horrifying ways to destroy the human body, it took one of the simplest organisms on Earth to keep that body alive. The story of the trench slugs is a quiet reminder that survival often depends on the things we overlook. We spent the 20th century trying to master the natural world, paving it over and poisoning it in the name of progress and conflict. Yet, in the defining catastrophe of that era, when the air itself turned toxic, all our industry and intellect could not save us. We had to rely on a creature we usually scrape off our shoes to tell us when it was safe to breathe. Thank you for watching. If you want to uncover more hidden stories from the edges of history and science, make sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.